the CO. Oh, which property would you be talking about? Would it be
along the canal?
Is that COID property that you be?
It's our property.
It's your property.
It's their easement.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you could get grant funding for that if it's, you know, you're trying to do defensible space. It just kind of depends on relationship to the houses.
Trees and brush.
Yeah.
Along
Yeah. Well, you know, maybe just you could reach out to me and just write kind of what your project is, and we could look at what kind of options there are for that kind of stuff. Patty, did you have?
I was just going to say, we did the commissioners allocated 45,000 because our revenue has actually come down. So we're having to be incredibly careful with what we allocate so we don't end up in a deficit. So that's, you know, hopefully maybe next spring we'll be able to bring that up a bit.
Yeah. Yeah, luckily we were able to use some of the Oregon State Fire Marshal funding that we got, and we combined that with discretionary funding. So we had, you know, roughly $70,000 for funding, and we'll be able to continue that. You know, and we'll just kind of base our grants on what we have for funding. But we have all that sweat equity money, so you know we're going to try and utilize that this fall, this spring, and see how that goes as well. Any other questions or comments? Gregory. Gregory, you online?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Gregory.
Yeah, I was just wondering, did you ask the commissioners for extra money on this last grant amount or not? Because, you know, Patty said there might be a possibility of getting more money.
I did, and I was wrong. We did look at it. I believe the awards were done when they asked me again, and so, you know, maybe next spring. You know, so our revenue is really coming in. We've booked it conservatively, and some of it is even coming in under what we booked in. Yet other things are coming in a bit more. So it'll all have to come together next spring.
Okay.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you. Back to you, Grant.
Okay, so today we have Tim DeBooth from Crook County, Natural Resource Policy Coordinator. And he's going to talk to us about Western Juniper in Oregon. So.
Well, thank you. Since I'm running off this, if it's all right, I'll continue to sit. Otherwise, I'll stand and wander because that's usually how I go. Good morning. Again, my name is Tim DeBooth. I live over out of Prineville. Our family moved to Central Oregon in 1987. I spent 32 years working for Oregon State University Extension Service as a county extension agent, dealing with range, livestock, natural resource issues. I retired from OSU about 5.5 years ago. That was on a Friday, and on a Monday, the following Monday, I went to work for Crook County as the coordinator of their natural resources policy, which for Crook County, it's a policy guideline that directs our county government in how they interact with natural resource issues, irregardless of land ownership, but within the confines of the county boundary. So that's a little bit about who I am, and I guess I'm here because I spent most of my career dealing with Western Juniper. I had the glorious opportunities of working with an awful lot of range researchers in my career who focused on juniper and its impact on the environment, its ecology and its biology, and so much of what I'm going to share with you today is actually from those individuals over the last. We've been studying juniper in different ways since the mid-60s. We really started focusing on it in the early 80s, and the research has kind of evolved as the issues have been identified since that time. So if you have any questions as we go, please don't hesitate to. Oh, this is probably not going to work. That's frozen. Sure why it's not. Back out and start again.
Stop.
I find it fascinating, Tim, that you just said they've been studying since the 1960s. There's a rule from 1963 that limits mental health facility beds to 16, and I've been fighting that rule. And thank goodness now, it's so limiting. You know, if we could have like 84 beds in a facility, but 16, how cost effective is that for mental health? And Senator White is actually working on getting that rule changed.
That's good.
I know, I'm like, oh, yeah, like, it's from 1963, is that incredible? And it's just, it doesn't help. I mean, you know, we did have a state hospital in Pelton that closed, and it has 16 beds there now. You know, look at our state, we have tremendous mental health issues, and, you know, the state hospital is a state prison, really. We need to change.
There we go. All right, sorry about the technical difficulties. All right, so again, kind of start things off, how familiar is the group with Western juniper? How many of these talks have you heard over time? Quite a few? No, some new? Okay. All right, well, you should always start off by saying, you know, Western juniper is a native species. It's relatively unique to Oregon. There are at least, well, there's 14 species of juniperus found throughout the United States. But the Juniperus occidentalis, Western juniper, is, like I said, unique to Oregon. It does sort of move down into Northern California a little bit. There's a subspecies in Northern California, Western juniper, called Sierra. A little bit of Northern Nevada, and just ekes into Idaho a little bit. But relatively, it is an Oregon tree. It has lots of importance. Some of the oldest trees are found east of Bend on Horse Ridge. It can reach thousands of years of age in the right situations. If you take the little drive between Bend and Alfalfa and Horse Ridge country, those are some of the oldest trees we have. They're the twisted, gnarly, the trunks twist over eons of time, the branches twist over eons of time. And that's what we would, if we were to talk about juniper old growth, that's the kind of country we would go to talk about juniper old growth. What I'm going to talk to you about today is really about the expansion of Western juniper since European people came to the Pacific Northwest. So really sort of that 1880s time period since. Like I said, I came in 1987. We used to talk about trees, post-European trees being 110 years old at the time. Now I have to reset my clock, and I now talk about post-European trees that are 150 years of age, because that 40 years seems to have flown by. And anyway, Western juniper woodlands provide lots of habitats for various critters, birds. They're unique. The old growth is usually found on rocky ridge tops, shallow soil areas. where wildfire really didn't have the fuels to carry, and so those trees survived. Some of our most recent work with Western juniper has been looking at the hydrological impacts of that expansion across the landscape. Yes, sir. Oh,
Stretch.
perfect. So there's where you will see all the different species of juniper across the United States. That big blue spot is called Juniperus virginiana, or eastern red cedar. It's found throughout the Midwest. But again, that purple up there in Oregon, that's our Western juniper. And all juniper is expanding across the landscape. It's not just a thing that's unique to Western juniper. We blow up into that area there again. The green now is where Western juniper is. The red is that Sierra subspecies. Again, just to emphasize, generally we find Western juniper in the old stuff, its historical range in the rocky ridge tops, low sagebrush zones where we again have very minimal understory, and then that Central Oregon pumice, that area between here, Horse Ridge, even out between here, Redmond and Sisters. Plant communities that are experiencing sort of some folks call it the invasion of Western juniper. Our mountain big sage is probably the most susceptible plant communities. Aspen, riparian areas, juniper is not a riparian species. And so if you see juniper growing in riparian areas along streams, it's because something else is wrong with that site. Low sagebrush, that's out on the desert. We're seeing it encroach into low elevation ponderosa pine, and the majority of almost all of our stands are still expanding, no matter how much work we've already done. This graph was put together by Dr. Rick Miller, one of those range ecologists I talked about earlier. It illustrates kind of, he spent the 90s kind of reviewing fire stars in ponderosa pine stands and other kinds of stuff to recreate some fire history. And you'll see that fire history in Central Oregon was fairly frequent up till the late 1800s, and then nothing. And the nothing is in part due to the introduction of livestock grazing. Livestock grazing ate a lot of the fine fuels, the grasses, and so the fires didn't carry like they used to. A lot of those early fires were not only natural caused, but Native American lit. And so we have less of that going on. And then again, we had a period of cold and wet in the late 1800s. Dr. Miller called it a little ice age. Perfect for germination, sapling development and establishment of trees, expansion of sagebrush, and we'll talk about why sagebrush is important to Western juniper. And then again, we got really good at putting out fires in the early 1900s. So with the exclusion of fire, we've seen the drastic increase in juniper establishment. This is just another depiction of the same story, sort of where this is looking at the rate of increase. So even today, the rate of increase is more than it was in the late 1800s, 1700s. But the great expansion occurred in the early 1900s, from 1900 to about 1940, is where most of our trees we see today, the time period of which they were established. And so in the 1930s, we had about 1.5 million acres of juniper in Eastern Oregon, and now we have about 10 million acres of juniper in Eastern Oregon. And if you're interested in where it's at, those counties represent where the majority of those acres now exist. You can see some counties have seen rather drastic increases since the 1930s. This data all came from the U.S. Forest Service, a published report in 2005. I always like to show this picture. This is the Keystone Ranch east of Prineville, Oregon, along Highway 26 on your way to Mitchell, just above Ochoco Reservoir. This photo was taken in the late 1800s and then retaken in the mid 1980s. And then I retook it in the mid 1990s. There was a little juniper cut down there in the middle of that ridge. But you can see how that hillside is filled in over the last 140 odd years. Just some other places to show sort of what the impact of that expansion looks like. On West Butte, 1969 and 2005. Rodman Rim out by Brothers, 1953 and 2003. So we begin to want to talk a little bit about the biology of Western juniper. Western juniper basically has two growth forms, what we call the juvenile form and the adult form. The juvenile form has this look to it, very stiff and erect leaflets, needles, whatever you want to call them. If you were to grab this plant and squeeze hard, you'd say, ouch. When it's transpiring, it's very sticky, sappy. This plant at this stage is very what we call water inefficient. It has no ability to control its stomates, so it's transpiring water all the time. It can be susceptible to drought and winter kill and all kinds of things at this stage because it can't control its stomates. How it survives during this period is that it looks to plants, primarily sagebrush, to be a host plant. Birds eat the seeds, robins, Townsend solitaires, lots of other things off the juniper. They go sit on a sagebrush plant. They process that seed through their body, expel it underneath the sagebrush plant, and that micro climate under that sagebrush plant is the perfect place for a juniper seedling to germinate, establish, and begin to grow. Because the sagebrush plant protects it from wind, it protects it from the extreme heats of the summertime, shades it, and because of the litter accumulation of sagebrush leaves and whatnot under the sagebrush plant, the soil moisture is relatively higher under the plant than it is in the inner spaces. You'll see other places where juniper sort of takes advantage of manipulation of that microclimate, sometimes along big rocks. You'll see a juniper sapling succeeding in growing again. It's because whatever that is around, it is manipulating that microclimate in order to let that sapling survive. And then over time, at about age 12, maybe, give or take, that sapling finally gets big enough, exits the canopy of the sagebrush plant, changes into what we call its adult growth form. And you'll see here where the needles now are very rounded, clasping each other. Now the tree becomes very water efficient in that it can now control its stomates. And so in the heat of the summer, it can tighten up. It'll stop or slow down significantly its transpiration, and it can survive long periods of drought. At this point, the tree is relatively what I might call bulletproof. It has no real disease, insect, fire can still take it out. But as it continues to grow, it eliminates whatever understory is underneath it. It kills its host plant, primarily through competition of moisture and nutrients and sunlight. The juniper tree in that first 12 years before it tops that sagebrush plant spends most of its time growing roots. It's really not spending any time in making top growth. If you were to excavate some of these roots at that stage, they could extend from the tree 5-6 feet from the center of the tree. Depending on the soil type, they'll have a tap root. Not always have a tap root, but generally they do. And again, they become very water efficient. They become very aggressive. Being an evergreen, they're able to transpire water 12 months out of the year, which is a unique characteristic in our dry climates, because out on the desert in the places where juniper is, we don't have any other evergreen species. So we have the nice warm days of January. This tree is going to transpire, where our shrubs and grasses are still dormant over the winter time. I throw this in because this is what we would call the old growth. The folks that deal with juniper, from our public land management agencies to our landowners to GMOs that are interested in this species, we all pretty much have come to an agreement about what an old growth juniper is. We don't describe it by age because juniper is so difficult to core. You just can't core it. Many of our juniper have dead centers, rotten centers, not always, but usually. And so it's just impossible to age it. So what we look for are trees that have rounded tops. They've gone from an inverted cone shape to this rounded top. They have deeply folded bark, and they have moss and lichens growing on the limbs. That's generally the characteristics we use to talk about old growth juniper. When we talk about how juniper moves across the landscape, we also have collectively come to talk about the 3 phases of juniper. We talked about phase 1, and this is the phase of which the trees are very small, density is very small, and shrubs and grasses still dominate the landscape. And then as we move into phase 2, we begin to talk about how the site is co-dominated by the trees and the shrubs. We still have an adequate stand of shrubs. We still don't see a lot of plant competition between trees and shrubs, although we begin to now see some, when we look at the new leader growth of shrubs, sagebrush, bitterbrush, that kind of stuff, we start to see a suppression of new annual leader growth of the shrubs in favor of the leader growth that's occurring on the trees.
Because they have less moisture mostly?
It's a plant competition, nutrient competition thing, yes. And then in phase 3, now we have moved into a juniper woodland where we have almost complete dominance of the western juniper. We've lost a significant amount, if not all, of our sagebrush. We've significantly reduced the amount of perennial grasses we have. And in many cases, we've moved to an annual forb, annual grass, understory component. At this time, the trees now are competing with each other. And the easiest way to look at if trees are competing with each other is to look at the leader growth on the sides of the tree, the limbs. If we see the beginning of pruning on juniper trees on the sides, we know we have tree-to-tree competition. And when we look at the top of the trees, if we don't have new leader growth or suppressed leader growth at the top of the trees, now we know that we pretty much have a complete infill of the site, and there just isn't any more resources for plant growth. There's enough to keep everybody alive, the junipers, but not enough to sort of continue the expansion.
If you have other species, because you're in a situation where you actually have extra water, how well does juniper compete, or how well, reverse the question, how well does, I know pond rose obviously is probably the other dominant tree, but particularly in the urban areas where they're starting to plant, you know, designer trees, you know, maples, it's the aspen, stuff like that. How does that all work, and how does that impact fire, fire hazards? There's several questions.
Sure. So in landscapes where we have supplemental water, water as a resource no longer becomes limited. So the trees you mentioned, aspen, maples, a lot of other things, you know, they're not here because in a 10 to 13 inch precip zone, there's just not enough moisture to.
Less than 11 inch.
Yeah, there's not enough moisture. But when we start irrigating, you know, we can grow just about anything. That's the advantage of, you know, we have great summers for growing, but we have limited water. So when we, you know, we add water, we can grow a lot more stuff. The difference from a fire issue between maybe some of those species and juniper is that juniper has a lot of volatile oils that are in the tree, in the berries, the fruit, which when ignited, you know, they burn. And a lot of those other trees maybe take more heat to ignite them because they don't have the volatile oils in them. But, juniper does have a lot of volatile oils in it, which once it ignites, it will take off.
So what's happening in, I mean, we're definitely in, you know, urban community, juniper forest.
Right.
And it seems to me, I mean, what's happened is the junipers are a lot taller. They're a lot of times more straggling, just because of the reach that you go off on. In terms of managing, I mean, and then with fire protection, the lower limbs are being limbed up. So what kind of impact does that have on the juniper trees there? How long they're gonna live, how they're gonna compete? Are they gonna allow more stuff, more of the shrubs and stuff to come up underneath them? Or if you're only up 8 feet or 12 feet or whatever it is, you know, how is it gonna change how the relationship between all of that?
Sure. Well, so managed landscapes are going to be way different than our wild landscapes. Limbing trees from the bottom up, from a fire standpoint, is the purpose is to get the limbs higher than the flame length's going to be. So if you allow or you plant shrubs under trees that you've limbed up, you've sort of you've taken away the benefit of limbing the trees up because you've now added a structure right under the tree that will carry the flame length up. So, you know, I would probably suggest that if you're looking at, you know, fire safe landscapes around your home and structures, and you're using, you know, limbing trees up, whether it's pine or juniper or fir, that you probably wouldn't want to plant anything underneath it. In some of the urban fringe, where by limbing trees, thinning trees, you might get a response with your understory native shrubs, you're probably still going to want to take out those shrubs from the standpoint of creating a fire-safe landscape.
Take out the tree.
Or take out the tree. And, you know, landscapes, we talk about adding more water will support more vegetation. But on the other hand, more vegetation may create more fire risk. So, you know, tree density is always probably something you want to worry about in managed landscapes. We worry about it on wildland landscapes, probably for two different reasons. Again, you're more worried about fire. We're more worried about hydrologic impacts out in our wildlands. But those would be all things I would suggest you think about as you're dealing with your urban interface zones and what I would call managed landscapes. So as we talk about sort of the impacts of this western juniper expansion, we talk about, again, decreases in our shrubs and perennial herbaceous biomass. And herbaceous biomass, I'm talking about both grasses and forbs, or flowering plants that we find on the desert. We reduce ground cover, which seems odd because as our tree canopy increases, you might think that, well, you're increasing ground cover, but what happens is the interspaces between trees is where we get a significant decrease in ground cover. And that's important from the standpoint of soil erosion. We see increases in soil erosion because of that interspace opening. We see a decrease in water infiltration, so less soil moisture and those kind of things. We lose diversity. The carbon sequestration is kind of an interesting thing. I look at junipers as sort of a bank of carbon sequestration with the vault door left open. So, you know, yeah, you can store money in it for a while, but sooner or later a fire, something's going to come along and wipe out, because the carbon's stored above ground, it's not stored below ground. So, you know, you might have a short-term benefit, but long-term, you really don't. We see a reduction in wildlife habitat. The one that most folks are concerned with today is sage grouse habitat. As trees increase, we lose sage grouse. Watershed function, we'll talk about that a little bit later. And then economic activity, because we see a decrease in carrying capacity, our ranches have to decrease the amount of animals they can run. Wildlife become fewer, so there's less hunting opportunities, lots of things tied to economics that tend to decrease.
Tim, what about the bitter brush? I've been told that it also affects that.
Yeah, so sagebrush is most susceptible to juniper expansion, and it will go out first, followed by bitterbrush. Bitterbrush is a little better at mining moisture out of the soil than sagebrush is. Its root system's a little bit different, but still, first we'll see a huge suppression in bitterbrush productivity. So from the standpoint of mule deer, winter range, that kind of stuff, we'll still see a big impact on juniper and bitterbrush stands, but over time we'll see the elimination of the bitterbrush stand as the juniper woodland develops and ripens, so to speak. So again, kind of the history of people doing something with juniper. Originally in the 60s, late 50s, 60s, the folks that manage wildlife saw the expansion of western juniper impacting winter range for primarily mule deer, but elk and some other things. And so it was our Department of Fish and Wildlife departments across the West that were really the first agencies that began to treat juniper, and it was for the purpose of improving winter range. Chaining was an important and popular thing back then. Chaining was the act of taking two D9, 10, 11 cats with a big anchor chain stretched between the two of them, one in the lead, one following, and they would pull the juniper trees over in the landscape. Usually they'd have to go 2 different directions in order to make sure they got the tree completely out of the ground, because if they just laid it over, they didn't pull the root system out, the tree would survive, and now you have this jungle of stuff laying on the ground. In the 70s, because of that, what they saw was an increase in forage production as a result of all of that effort. And so in the 70s, we saw a lot of juniper work being done under the guise of improving forage production, primarily for ranches. The result of that in the 80s was we saw a reduction in soil erosion with all that extra grass and organics on the soil surface. We saw a reduction in soil erosion. So in the 80s, we began to sort of do, most of our juniper work began to focus on reduction of soil erosion, sort of trying to improve on-site soil moisture content, because with soil moisture, that's why we got more grass, right? More shrub. But in the 80s and through that time period, people began to notice that, you know, gosh, I cut a bunch of juniper trees and I had a spring that suddenly became more productive. Or I have a spring now that I never knew was there. And some of these stories where people that had lived on that spot for 20, 30, 50, 60 years. So a long time of not ever seeing one, and now they see one. 2 other stories in the late 80s where we were turning intermittent streams to almost perennial streams with some of our larger juniper work. And so people began to say, wow, by cutting juniper trees, we can improve the hydrologic function of some of our rangelands, and kind of like Moses tapping the rock, we can cut a tree and make water flow again. And so we saw a lot of our federal agencies start to write in their NEPA documents in the 80s, early 90s, well, I'm going to cut juniper trees and I'm going to have better fish habitat for hot and cutthroat trout, or I'm going to cut juniper trees and improve water flow for short-nosed suckers. And so there got to be a lot of this stuff that I'm going to do this and that will happen. And the environmental community said, no, but wait a minute. You have no data to prove that. You know, we just don't want you going out willy-nilly cutting juniper trees and doing something that you can't prove that you're going to do. So in the 90s, we began to look at the hydrological impacts of Western juniper expansion across where it exists. So where do we find Western juniper? Well, we find it in the 10 to 18-inch precip zone. We know that it maintains photosynthetic material year-round. So like I said, it can transpire as long as the air temperature, soil temperatures are adequate for plant activity. And we know that juniper tree canopies can intercept 20 to 50% of the annual rainfall that is delivered to a site. And that range is based on the canopy percentage of the tree itself. So if we have a 20% canopy across the landscape, that canopy will intercept 20%. It's a one-to-one relationship. We also know that in order to get what we call through-fall of water coming through the juniper canopy and getting you wet, the old adage used to be, you know, in a rainstorm, unless it's lightning, stand under a juniper tree and you'll stay dry. Because it takes a significant amount of moisture to get through that canopy. In fact, it's about 3/10 of an inch per storm. The problem is about 90% of our storms are less than that 3/10 of an inch. So big impact there on that canopy. The fish story that everybody loves to tell is how much water does a juniper tree use? The old research had it about 25 gallons per tree per day for a tree that was 12 inches DBH, diameter breast height. And the caveat was as long as the soil moisture was available. You can't use that kind of water if the ground's dry. Some of our more recent studies have shown that with adequate soil moisture and the right atmospheric conditions, that same tree that we have thought was using 25 can now has the ability to really use maybe up to 40 gallons per day. So some of the stories I was always told just listening at the coffee shop is, well, juniper tree can use 60 gallons of water. Well, that's the fish story, Every time we tell the story, it's got to get a little better. So just for a little math, a 12-inch, so that the 25 gallons per day, that's almost 5,000 gallons per tree per year. Saplings, we now have sapling data, so those trees under 12 feet of height, they're going to use about 70 gallons per year. And so what that means, as you're looking on the landscape, is 9 to 30 trees per acre can use all the water that's delivered in that 13-inch precip zone. And we have tree densities of those large trees anywhere from 10 to 300. So it's not hard to understand how those folks who were working and living on the land, when they removed a bunch of juniper trees, thought they saw some response. And I throw this picture in because this kind of illustrates the water holding capacity of the juniper canopy. A snow that is held up in the canopy, you look under those trees, you see bare ground underneath the tree and snow in the interspaces. And so that's the intercept that we're talking about. That's what it looks like. So in 1994, we created, Oregon State University, the Prineville District BLM, private landowner Northrop Brothers, Doc and Connie Hatfield, and a whole bunch of other partners created what we call the Camp Creek Paired Watershed Study. It was originally funded by EPA dollars. We wanted to look at, since we couldn't go find a stand that was still sagebrush grass and watch it over time to be juniper woodland and then go back, what we wanted to answer was, okay, so if we cut juniper trees, what happens with the water? And so here's where we are. This is on the west branch of Camp Creek, north of Brothers, about 10 miles. The advantage we had here is we collected what we call baseline data from 1994 to 2005. So for 11 years, we collected everything from moisture, soil moisture, precip. We installed groundwater wells. We put flumes in dry channels. We did everything we could, and we instrumented 2 springs, one in each treatment area for the purpose of beginning to collect water information, how these watersheds respond to precipitation over time. The 11 years allowed us to have some drought years, allowed us to monitor some wet years, and what we might call the average years. All kinds of instrumentation. This is maize. The 2 watersheds we call Maize and Jensen in honor of the homesteaders in that area. Maize we ultimately chose in 2005 to cut the juniper. We removed all the juniper except the old growth. And this is what it looked like prior to treatment. That's what it looked like after we cut the trees in 2006. Here is some of the water information that we've recently collected, updated on our water use per tree. Showing in wet years, we have the capability of using up to that 40 gallons per day per tree. And then in the drier years, we're more down in that 25 gallons of water in the peak use. The nice thing about this chart is it illustrates more of the annual water use of the tree. So, and we we have to recognize in September, October, November, that we might be only using 5 to 15 gallons of water per day. And in August, we're maybe down to, 10. But in May and June, when soil moisture is high, that's when the water use is high. And same thing with our saplings. In wet years, they're going to use more water per day than in the dry years. And so this is kind of what the area looks like in relationship to how precipitation and water is expressed. In that very top bar, that's the precipitation that comes to the site. So most of the precipitation in this part of the world comes from October 1 to May 1. 70% of our annual precipitation comes in what most of us think of as the dormant season. That's important because if your precip comes during the dormant season, then most of the precip has the chance to recharge our soil moisture profiles, and then excess water that's infiltrated in the soil has the opportunity to move down deeper and begin to recharge our groundwater aquifers. And so it's also important because the old adage, snow makes our fills our reservoirs, and spring rains makes our grass grow. So it's that winter precip that's important for us in Central Oregon to kind of create the storage and then the summer flows that we experience. The middle graph is a reflection of soil moisture response to the precipitation. And you can see that, this graph, we're getting precip in November, December, and then we begin to pick it up in our soil moisture monitoring in mid-December through January. And it's a fairly quick response that these soils begin to move water down into the soil profile and beyond the rooting zone. And then the bottom graph, in both the drainages, we have 6 wells, shallow wells across the valley bottom. And we're monitoring depth to groundwater. And these wells are anywhere from 17 feet deep to 27 feet deep. So they're not deep wells by any stretch of the imagination. But again, near surface groundwater responding relatively quickly following the beginning of our precip period in December.
And I think Greg had a question.
Oh, yes.
You got a question?
Unmute.
Yeah, I have a question. I was just wondering, how does other pine trees, how much water do they take in? Do you have an idea of that?
Similar amounts. Yep. The difference is pine grows in a different precip zone, and so the whole water relationship is different. Although I would argue that as any tree density begins to increase, we're going to change the water balance of that site. And we're going to see, again, more canopy intercept. We're going to be experiencing more on-site water use by the vegetation that's there, and we'll have less water available for moving off-site for all the other uses that water gets used for.
And the tree stand gets drought stressed, at least right now.
Yeah, and a dense tree stand that's drought stressed is susceptible to insect disease and fire. So the principles are the same, the water use is the same. What makes it a little different is the precip is different. But again, when we have more trees, more vegetation than the site can support, we begin to see these hydrologic negatives occur. And so this, go ahead. Did I answer that all right? Perfect. All right, so here again is a chart showing snowpack accumulation over time. And remember, out on the desert, it's not like the ski hill. Our snowpack is transitory in the wintertime. It comes and goes. We have snow and then we have bare ground, and then we have snow and bare ground. It doesn't accumulate like it does here in the wintertime. It builds on over time. So, but you can see our well responses to that water as it becomes available. So some of the stuff that's been done, I became less involved in this project in 2017-18 when I retired. It's still actively being monitored by folks from OSU. They've expanded some of the monitoring that's occurred. One of the questions that came during our study was, okay, well, you've shown changes on site of water variation, but can you show that that water impact moves downslope? And this is what we would hope would happen, is that the benefits of something we do in the uplands as cumulative as it moves downstream, downslope. And so those researchers have now established some groundwater wells in the Camp Creek Valley itself, and have begun to show that what I call our water bubble, it's the hydrologic curve. You think of a stream and its hydrologic curve as runoff occurs, it peaks and then it drops off. Well, our groundwater hydrologic curve is exactly the same, only it's delayed 30, 40 days. And that hydrologic bubble now moves downslope out of our treated area, and we've been able to pick it up in the Camp Creek Valley a couple of weeks after it shows up in our deal. So there is a hydrologic connection subsurface to some of this work that we're doing. We've begun to, or we began to show that the juniper canopy is a significant interceptor of precip, and we used to just think of tree water use, but it turns out that interception is significant. And in a 13-inch precip zone, when you're losing 20% of the precip, that's 2 to 3 inches. So we've taken a 12-inch precip zone and turned it into a 8-9-inch precip zone. And then we compete with water for plant growth, groundwater recharge, and hopefully ultimately stream flow, river flow, reservoir storage, happy fish, all those kinds of benefits that we talk about. I finally had to take my napkin math and turn it into something that hopefully people could see and understand. What we now know from this, between intercept and water use, a typical juniper stand takes about 5 acres of juniper to use an acre-foot of water. That's a relatively safe, conservative rule of thumb. And that takes into account the big trees, the little trees that intercept, and the use. In Crook County, as an example, since 1936, we've seen a little over increase of 600,000 acres of juniper. So if we just look at that 600,000 acres, that's the equivalent of 150,000 acre-feet of water. And Prineville Reservoir, if you're familiar with it, stores 150,000 acre-feet of water. Some of the historical stuff, the Watermaster in the early 1900s, as they were adjudicating water throughout Oregon, estimated there was about 400,000 acre-feet of water coming out of the Crooked River in what we call the upper country. Most recent estimates put that figure at about 300,000 acre feet. And so the numbers of if we sort of look at, not saying there's a true cause and effect yet, but as we look at the acres of increased juniper, we contemplate the amount of increased density of our pine and fir stands in the Maoris and the south slopes of the Ochicos, and we begin to think about water reduction, we almost can account for that 100 to 120,000 acre feet reduction now being measured out of the Crooked River Basin. If we were to allocate, one of the things we managing is our endangered species, the HCP agreement between the irrigation districts and U.S. Fish and Wildlife and that kind of stuff. The desired flow in the Crooked River is about 180 CFS. That's not to say that's the historical flow, but if they were to manage, for optimum fish production, fish habitat, happy fish, they'd be wanting in the lower stretches of the Crooked River 180 CFS. And that 153,000, if we divvy that up, that's about 210 CFS a day. So again, if we sort of look at some of what we think are important values, we can begin to maybe look at that part of the juniper woodland that's expanded as maybe an opportunity to support. And we've spent an awful lot of time looking at ways of doing that work. We've had purpose-built equipment, meaning people who went to their shop, built a piece of machinery for the purpose of cutting juniper and went out and cut a bunch of juniper. The problem with that is that purpose-built equipment doesn't have a parts bin behind it. So when something breaks, you got to go build the part. So we then sort of evolved into, well, forestry's been doing a great job of creating machinery to work different kinds of landscapes. Can we use forestry machinery? And yes, we can. We've used feller bunchers, we've used forwarders, we've used tub grinders to process juniper, maybe for wood chips, bedding material, all that kind of stuff. What we call a baler, that machine in the upper right-hand corner is a baler on a forwarder. It takes juniper logs and may think of a hay bale. It compresses and ties twine around those. That project was demonstrated on the grasslands when Warm Springs still had their biomass facility. Those bales were hauled to Warm Springs. They processed them and put them through their boiler system. So lots of opportunities. Of course, chainsaws are still the most popular methodology for juniper harvesting and control. The problem is you got to do something afterwards if you want to reduce fuel loads. Prineville is looking at a biomass plant, so they're looking at opportunities to extract juniper and make use of it. Of course, our slash piles in the forest are potential sources for the biomass plant, and so the city's exploring that, and probably 60-70% designed and moving forward. So they're pretty serious about it.
Quick question, when you pull the juniper, you just lop it off, what percentage of its water use goes away if you don't pull the roots?
Well, if you sever the tree below the lowest limb on a mature tree, you will kill the tree, and so your water use goes to zero.
Okay. And quickly.
Yeah. One of the things, over time with juniper treatments, you learn is that some of those trees have limbs clear to the ground. And some of those limbs are buried in a duff layer and sort of exit the surface a couple of feet away from the bole of the tree itself. And if you do not remove all the limbs, you did not kill the tree. And that tree will probably turn into a big shrub, which will be harder to control the next time. We do have some people who are pulling juniper, not really big trees, but what I might call the mid-sized to small, either with skidster mounted squeeze that they lift or excavator mounted grapples that you cut the tree and pull. And there's some advantages to doing that, particularly if you don't like stumps. It can aerate the soil a little bit, loosen the soil because you're pulling those roots out. It does pose additional risks to annual invasive grasses because you've exposed bare mineral soil. You can short run increase some soil erosion, but it works.
You know, Governor Kotek actually likes the idea of your biomass plant. And the other thing I thought that was happening in Prineville was a couple years ago, you had someone that was pelletizing junipers. Wasn't there someone with like a small operation and unfortunately?
Yeah, back in the 90s, the Bikers, I think was their name. They were making juniper pellets for pellet stoves. That worked for a while. The problem with burning juniper, if anybody burns juniper in their wood stove, is its high ash content. And so you're always cleaning. And in a pellet stove, sometimes that cleaning, it makes it difficult. So that didn't work very well. John Shelk and Malheur Lumber, a couple of years ago, forget the technical term, they made what I call the hockey puck, which was a carbonized puck. You can make it out of juniper, pine, fir. The idea was to condense woody material into these pucks. And then they actually did a test fire at the Boardman coal plant 3-4 years ago. Wasn't to replace coal, but it turns out that when you added a small percentage of these wood pucks into the coal boilers, that you increased the burn efficiency and significantly reduced emissions. And so they were looking at that as a way. Of course, Boardman's now closed. They were also hoping for a significant overseas market because turns out some countries are ahead of us in some of this technology in energy and biomass, but those markets never developed. So that facility is built but idle. Last time I talked to Mr. Shell. And most recently, speaking of the state legislature, is excited about some of the early results of the hydrologic work that's been done with juniper. And as a result of that, championed a bill that would have brought $10 million to Central Oregon for juniper work. Ultimately, it brought a little over $2 million for the purpose of the state sort of beginning to cost share with landowners to do large scale juniper work for the purpose of restoring hydrologic function. A lot of our juniper work today that has cost share dollars attached to it might be fire programs, might be mule deer habitat improvement programs, our sage grouse habitat improvement programs, but nothing that really has yet sort of targeted this hydrologic issue. So these state dollars that are coming, Deschutes County's getting, I think, about 150,000. Crook is getting 800,000, but the counties affected are Crook, Deschutes, Jefferson, Wheeler, Lake, Klamath, and Harney. And 3 locations. OSU also got some additional dollars in that package to provide leadership to some intensive monitoring, not as intensive as we did in Camp Creek, but again, to sort of look at, did we get the response we thought we might? And to answer the question for some of us, is Camp Creek an anomaly, or is Camp Creek a reflection of what we might be able to obtain in the future? So that's kind of, and the state was the House of Representatives, Representative Helm from the Portland area and Representative Owens from Harney County that championed that legislation. And in their Ag Water Committee, there were no nay votes. There were a couple of environmental organizations that had some early concerns. Those concerns were addressed in the final bill, and there was no opposition to that bill, and on either the House or the Senate side. And the governor signed the bill.
She did sign it.
The money is to arrive shortly, and it's coming to the soil and water districts. They'll be identifying the watersheds where they'll be doing the work. And so if you're interested in following that, contact your local SWCD, Soil and Water Conservation District. They should be able to. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I got a couple of questions and maybe an observation. When you look out at areas where there's like acreage of juniper, it looks like most of them have the pointy tops. So that would be what, less than 150 years?
Yeah,
About how long?
that would be what we would call this sort of current expansion. Those are the young and mature trees, not old growth.
And then historically, they would survive more in the ridge areas, that sort of stuff where fire couldn't get to them. Okay, so when you're removing the bitter brush, the juniper, some of it can be used, but a lot of it is just burned in piles. I mean, I know it makes really excellent fence posts, for instance.
Yeah, fence posts, firewood are the traditional uses of juniper. We now have a small juniper mill who are making dimensional wood out of it. A couple of years ago, OSU was able to conduct the wood test. So structurally now it can be used to build things. Its numbers are in the book that identifies all wood species and what their wood structure, so that like engineers can say, well, you can a 2x4 of fir or whatever. I'm out of my realm now. So, but anyway, so it's now in the book. The reason it got in the book was organizations like ODOT was interested in juniper because of its longevity in the soil when you make a fence post out of it, for signposts, guardrail posts, that kind of stuff. And they couldn't use it until they had those numbers, because they had to design, the shear things. What happens if a vehicle runs into it? Will it give way? All those kind of things that you have to do when you design those kind of things. So now it's in the book. Artisans have used juniper for quite a while in all kinds of things. And now probably biomass is the newest thing, although it's not new. And we always figure that in a juniper stand, probably 90% of the trees would make great biomass. 5% probably makes good dimensional wood. And then, the rest of the stand is there. But traditionally, what we used to do is cut the trees, let it lay for 3 to 10 years, run a prescribed fire through it, and remove the material with fire.
So how's most of the material processed now? Is it like
it's still
burned?
piled and burned?
Piled and burned.
Yeah. You think of some of the remote areas where juniper exists and the treatments are occurring. we just, economics begins to play into
And then-
this as well.
And then just as kind of like a side note almost, biomass, I mean, I was on a real hobby horse with it for a while. And because of the transportation of the materials, is there potential to have like smaller biomass processing, to where you don't have to take it to another county or something?
Yeah, so there are small scale biomass facilities that exist. In my career with Extension in Prineville, I had 4 what I call serious inquiries to commercial biomass facilities. Industry wanted to come build a biomass plant in Prineville. And almost all of those inquiries when they started were in the 5 to 10 megawatt range. And by the time they finished, they were in the 40 to 60 megawatt, which was ridiculous because you start running into serious problems of transportation, sourcing material. Because once you build the beast, you got to feed it. And you go to Susanville, those places where they have biomass plants, and the old adage used to be 50-mile radius was sort of the economic haul distance for biomass material. But again, once they build the plant, the 50-mile radius seems to disappear because you got to have material. I mean, for White City, they're hauling stuff from Sisters. That's more than 50 miles. So, that kind of goes away. So the Prineville facility has stuck at 20 megawatts. They figure, if over time, if they want to make it bigger, they'll add more capacity later in the future. But 20 megawatts seems to be sort of the sweet spot for the kind of woody material resources that are in the Tri-County area. With the City of Prineville Railroad.
So they can have a consistent source.
Actually, what turns out to be the really consistent source is the City of Prineville Railroad hauling woody material from landfills in the valley that have a problem with landfills filling up with woody material. And so they can move that over and bring it. And so you'll probably, the site they've selected has rail access. Just outside of town on Lamont. So those are the kind of sources of woody material. Of course, ag waste can be a material as well. So our ag producers have the opportunity maybe in the future of, straws, that kind of stuff after they harvest the crop. So yeah, the big issues with woody biomass have always been air quality. And evidently with the new technologies of scrubbers, boilers, and that kind of stuff, that air quality issues are, I don't want to say insignificant, but they're greatly reduced.
Then I live in South Deschutes County, and my father, bought the property that I'm on now. Well over 50 years ago, and as that area was developed, it was one of the most popular things for people to plant around their houses. I mean, this is Project Wildfire, was juniper. The cabin that's on our property, my father planted a juniper tree at each corner of the cabin and planted juniper tams in between them. But you were talking about the volatility of the resins in those plants.
Yeah.
And they just burn like gasoline. Yeah. And it's an ongoing kind of thing on especially older properties that were developed earlier on to convince people to not have juniper all around their decks and houses.
I have not gotten to see it, but some of my ODF firefighting friends describe fighting fire in juniper stands and the little berries igniting and becoming little fire bombs. They catch the winds of the fire and just kind of float out ahead of the fire, these little fire bombs. So, yeah, I don't,
Yeah, so we don't, in South Deschutes County, we don't have much in the way of juniper except for what maybe birds bring in or something here and there. But it turns out to be a high source for home ignitions because people planted them around their structures.
I call them Roman candles.
yeah,
Yeah.
you had a question.
Well, I was curious about the prescribed burning. I mean, that might be the, most inexpensive way to just clear, big areas. Have you studied that as being a way to just start clearing, large stands and big hills, hills and that sort of thing?
Yeah, so I thought about that this morning as I was getting ready to come over here, some of the old fire stories. So some of you may have known of Byron Cheney. Byron worked for the Ochoco National Forest for a long time on the grasslands forever. Byron was what I would call a pyro. And he loved prescribed fire in juniper. And his favorite time of the year to burn was mid-August, when we had high temperatures, low humidity, and 30-mile-an-hour winds. And everybody else was, panicking. He'd be out on Gray Butte and whatnot, igniting juniper trees. And that's what it took to make a juniper tree burn with a prescribed fire, a mature stand, because you had to get the crown to ignite and you had to have the winds to move the fire through the system. We've had people who have tried what we call thinning. So they go in and they'll cut 30% of the trees and leave them lay on the ground, let them dry for a couple of years, and then hope that that material is enough to ignite the crown and move the fire. Those folks never got brave enough to actually ignite the fire when they could have. So I think what we see now is landscapes. Let's talk about a juniper woodland, phase 3. They'll come in, they'll cut the trees. If it's sage grouse habitat, they have to limb all the trees so nothing stands taller than 4 feet above the soil surface. That's so birds of prey won't. That's the problem with a lot of junipers in sage grouse country is birds of prey sit on the juniper trees and scope out the sage grouse and go pick them off. So nothing's over 4 foot height. So that slash material, they'll let it lay for a couple of years. They recognize that they probably didn't get 100% of the saplings cut when they did that first treatment. And so a prescribed fire 3 to 10 years later takes out all that woody material that was a result of the cut. Plus, it will kill those saplings because a sapling is with limbs clear to the ground is still susceptible to those ground fires, and it's a much safer fire situation than the one that Byron liked.
Did he really do that?
Honest God, yeah. Oh my God, yeah.
Were people like going, whoa?
Oh yeah, that was his big deal. He didn't always get the clearances he wanted from his bosses, but yeah, it was his fire scenario for prescribed juniper work in the grasslands. Wow.
So for areas where you've got the encroachment of the juniper into the pine stands, is there a recommendation on management for that?
Well, yeah, so now, so juniper doesn't belong there, so it's get rid of it. I also have the same problem with pine encroachment, but nobody talks about pine encroachment because pine has economic value. We have this, we like pine trees. We don't like juniper trees. I like juniper. Some of the trees to me are very unique, and so anything I say today, I'm not into junicide, but certainly we need to look at those sites where we have invasion. But in pine, juniper doesn't belong in pine. So again, you have a plant-to-plant competition that's going to go on. It's going to stress the pine trees. And so you got that disease, insect, fire issue. But pine's moving down slope. So you have pine where pine doesn't belong, and you shouldn't be afraid to remove pine trees.
Yeah, there's plenty of pine encroachment.
But, you know, I had realtor friends of mine recommending to ranches who were getting ready to sell to stop cutting juniper trees because society, we like trees. And the idea of cutting trees is, you know, we hate clear cuts, we hate, you know, all this kind of stuff dealing with cutting trees. So you stop cutting trees because you're going to reduce the value of the ranch and I won't be able to sell it for you. Well, you know, hopefully with some of this water stuff, some of the invasive species stuff that we didn't talk about, you know, the cheatgrass, medusa head, ventonata, the 3 winter annual grasses that are now, you know, problem 1 right after juniper trees in much of our part of the world, and they burn like, you know, gasoline. When you light cheatgrass on fire, poof, it's gone. So, but anyway, you know, so it's sort of that trying to help folks through that thought process that, you know, cutting a tree is not bad, and we have trees that are out of place, and we shouldn't feel bad about, you know, if we're really interested. You know, we can have a few in our managed landscapes. I like trees, you know, kids like to climb trees, build tree forts, all that kind of stuff. So trees are good, but too many trees are not good.
The example that you cited is one example of people not looking in the long, the long term, you know, because the forest and plant ecology is working over, you know, hundreds of years, and we're like this, you know.
Yeah, and with, you know, the change in our climate, you know, we ought to be not only worried about, you know, the you know, how much gas we burn in our cars and all that other kind of stuff. We ought to be worried about what our landscapes are looking, and are they going to be resilient enough to respond to changes in precipitation and temperature over time.
Your primary criteria for saying there are too many junipers in a stand is percent of canopy coverage.
Well, so again, back to the juniper characteristics, being evergreen in a location where we have no other evergreens. Its water use and consumption of water, and then its intercept, which affects, you know, if we're moving into a rain-driven system instead of a snow-driven system, again, you know, we're still going to intercept that rain in the canopy. It's going to evaporate back into the atmosphere, you know, and we're all going to sit at the table and argue about, you know, how much water is in Prineville Reservoir and who gets it. And I want us to focus on the uplands and say, well, is there an opportunity to put more water in Prineville Reservoir so that our arguments become, you know, less focused on that and more of is the system in balance with what it can produce.
I have a quick question. I know here in Central Oregon, there's a lot of mistletoe.
There's some, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I see it everywhere.
Yeah, the only mistletoe is, it may kill part of the tree, it doesn't kill the tree. The only thing I've seen in my career that kills a juniper tree, in addition to fire and a chainsaw, is we've had, and they're about every 10-year events, we will have a winter weather pattern that we will have a warm period of temperature followed by an immediate drop in temperature, like we'll go from 50-degree days to 0 in like 2 days. And we will get, I think they call it cavitation, freezing of the cambium layer in the juniper tree. It explodes the water transporting capillaries in the tree, and anything that's above wherever that explosion occurred will die. And even I've got calls from all over the 3 counties when I was working for Extension about, come about June, hey, the tops of my juniper trees are turning red, how's come? And and it was kind of like, well, give it a little bit longer, and if they all turn red, then the tree's dead. Red is dead. And from a fire perspective, you better get them out of there because those red needles are just gonna. But that weather pattern, that winter weather pattern, just freeze dries the tree and kills it. And it can kill just the top of it, or it can take the entire tree out. And it can be whole stands. I've seen stands 5-10 acres in size that were completely killed. On the north slopes of Grizzly, I think it was in '97, there was the Sisters area experienced the same thing that winter in pine, but on Grizzly it was juniper. There was an elevation band that turned red, and you could see it for like 3 years until the needles dropped, and then you couldn't see it anymore. But it was an area that this winter kill had occurred.
So Tim, in January of 14, it was 29 below in Sisters, but if it was like not that different, a couple days before, that wouldn't have really impacted, that wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
It's the range then.
Yeah, the year I remember, I say '97, the year I remember, let's see, my kids graduated from high school in 2002, 2, 4, and 6. So it was like 2001 or 2, a group of us went to the National FFA Convention in Louisville, Kentucky, which is early November. There were like 6 male adults who left their wives and kids at home. And that weekend, pipes and houses froze here in Central Oregon. There was that sudden drop in temperature that occurred, and we were all in trouble because the plumber needed to be called, and we needed to call the plumber right away. Well, it was the next spring when we had all these reports of dying juniper trees. Why are my juniper trees dying? And nobody really cared out on the wildlands, but when it was in a managed landscape, that juniper tree suddenly has economic value. It does, honestly. I got involved in a court case on the, it's now Brasada, but before it was Brasada, a person had leased some property, significant acres. They had gone in and thinned some juniper trees on that property as the leasee. Well, they forgot to ask the landowner if it was okay. And the landowner sued the renter for lost juniper trees, and they put a landscape value on those trees of like $1,000, $2,000 a tree, as opposed to, at the time we were cutting juniper trees for $50 an acre.
So who won the case?
The landowner.
They did.
Yeah. They settled, but it didn't cost him as much as it probably should have.
I don't know if there have been studies made, but I know that junipers are a significant source of allergen for a lot of people.
A lot of people.
You hear
March and April.
Juniper fever. Now, so the pine, I think, just pollinates once a year. Does juniper pollinate more than once a year?
No, once a year. You can sit on the hill slopes in March and April and watch the trees explode. This yellow poof, and then it just kind of. I didn't used to be allergic to juniper, but I am now. I spent too much time in them, I guess.
It takes 9 years and then it happens.
Is that it?
It's really bad.
Yeah, my eyes water now.
All right, guys, we're a little over. Sorry about
Oh,
that.
sorry.
So like we were having a good conversation, so I didn't want to cut it off. I appreciate you coming and teaching us more about Western juniper, Tim. That was a great presentation. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I appreciate it. That's great.
Thank
If you have
for
any
coming.
questions, I'm easy to find. You can call the extension office in Brineville. I retired, but they still let me come to work in the mornings. So that's where the county kept me, was in the extension office at the fairgrounds.
Thank you, Sam. Great.
Yes.
Could you?
Thank you.
It's fascinating. What they're really doing, the 25 to 50.
Yeah.
There's 5 reasons why
Yeah.
you need to actually like people that are closer together for the protection. I have to drive.
August
around.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Oh.
It's bad Juniper house.
Yeah.
Or I call it.